Welcome to In Conversation. I'm your host, Steve Iverson. Our guest today is Jill Stein, a Lexington resident who is the leading contender for the nomination for the Green Party presidential candidacy. Did I get that correct, Jill?
You did, Steve.
Okay.
Well said.
All right, thank you. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming on.
It's an honor.
I know you just got back from a big trip to Russia. I'm glad we could fit this in.
Thank you.
Would you like to say just a bit about what it means to be the leading contender for the nomination for the Green Party?
The Green Party, like the Democratic and Republican parties or other small parties, has a process. And in fact, the Green Party will hold a convention around the same time that the Democratic and Republican parties do, too. Okay. And, you know, the Green Party is mainly, I'd say it is the alternative to establishment politics that so many Americans deeply object to and are looking for alternatives for. We are the one non-corporate sponsored national party out there. That's sort of, in a way, that really defines our mission and our universe, to be a party of, by, and for everyday people, not a party sponsored by predatory banks, fossil fuel companies, and war profiteers, insurance executives, etc., who are the funders of the establishment parties.
Gotcha. And the general goals and aims of the Green Party, beyond what you've just said, might include what? What sort of changes would the Green Party like to see happen in this country?
You know, I think it's fair to say that everyday people are having a really hard time. We're told we're in a recovery, but actually for most American families it's an emergency. We know that 1 out of every 2 American families is now either at the poverty level, below it, or just barely above it. And that's according to the Census Bureau and other, reputable organizations. Average wage is right now just barely above poverty level. So Americans are having a hard time. The costs of health care and housing are skyrocketing. An entire generation of young people is in debt. That's 40 million people are in debt, and the jobs aren't there to pay it back. We're told, that the unemployment is down, but most of the jobs since the crisis of 2008, most of the new jobs are low-wage, part-time, and temporary jobs. So young people are hard-pressed to pay their rent, let alone pay back the loans. So they don't have a future. Meanwhile, we have this expanding war on terror that has been such an unmitigated disaster, has cost the average household in the US of A has paid $75,000 for this war on terror. Right? $6 trillion, $75,000 per household over the past decade. Yet we are less secure than we were at the outset. And effectively, this bombing and shooting up of terrorists gets lots of people, in the crossfire. Far more are killed than are intended. And when you knock off a terrorist, you've got 10 to replace them. And that's basically what's happened here. So you have an extremely misguided and destructive war effort, which is going full tilt on behalf of both parties. In addition, we've got the meltdown of the climate and an economy which is really going in reverse right now. So where the Green Party stands is where about 50% of Americans stand. And in fact, latest polls say 21% of Americans identify as Republicans, 29% as Democrats, and 50% as independent, have repudiated both of those parties, or are with small independent parties. So our job, our mission, my purpose as a candidate is to lift up the urgent needs of everyday people and the real solutions that are available to us right now to cancel student debt. We canceled debt for the bankers who got us into this mess.
That's a good point.
Why not for the young people who've been victimized by the waste, fraud, and abuse of banking and Wall Street? We bailed them out to the tune of $17 trillion. What young people need is somewhere around a little over $1 trillion, $1.3 trillion. We can do the same thing. We can do the same quantitative easing for young people and have it be a much more productive and effective stimulus package for our entire economy to free people up to actually be able to do their creative work, to re-envision and reimagine the future, which is what our younger generation is always supposed to do. So we have solutions like that. We're calling for a Green New Deal, which would solve both the economic crisis and the climate crisis in one fell swoop. It's outrageous that this is kept off the table. We have a climate emergency and we have an economic emergency, and the conventional wisdom is that you got to choose one or the other. Solve either problem. You can't have both climate solutions and jobs, but that's actually the opposite of the way it is. When Pearl Harbor was bombed in the Second World War, it took us 6 months basically to transform the economy to a wartime footing. We need to declare the climate emergency that we have right now and use that as an opportunity to basically put everyone back to work, to ensure that everyone has a full-time living wage job as part of that green new economy, creating the solar, the wind, insulating our homes, businesses, and schools, the efficiency, creating a new public transportation system, building the new high-speed engines and rail, light rail and heavy rail and so on. We can be the builders of this economic transformation, solve our economic crisis at the same time that we solve the climate crisis. It's simply a matter of casting off the chains of the status quo interests, the big money of fossil fuels and nuclear, that basically have a stranglehold on our elected officials and both of our political parties. The third piece we would put into that, by the way, so we talk about clean energy and about public transportation and also creating a food system, a sustainable, healthy food system, not a GMO, industrialized Frankenfood system, which is very dangerous for biodiversity, basically pours pesticides on the environment, because that's what the new GMO products are about, basically being pesticide tolerant, which is no virtue at all and is basically dangerous for everyone involved. We can have a healthy and sustainable food system, not one that's extremely vulnerable to fluctuations in the fossil fuel supply, which the industrial system relies on, and one which subsidizes and prioritizes healthy, local, sustainable food like fruits and vegetables that are desperately missing from the American diet, especially in low-income areas and communities of color that live in food deserts. So we can fix these problems in one fell swoop and basically revive our economy, turn the tide on climate change, and make wars for oil obsolete by creating this green energy system. Then we no longer need the friggin' wars for oil, which in turn frees up $500 billion a year. That's basically half the military budget that we could be putting back into this. And it creates a health revolution as well. That's something I think is really important to stress, because it usually gets left out of the discussion. And as a medical doctor, I want to really emphasize that what's good for the planet is also good for the economy and workers, and it's also really good for our health, because if you eliminate the pollution and you're creating a healthy food supply and a transportation system that creates public transit, and you can walk and safely bike in between your transit hubs, this is what real health care looks like. Right now we spend $3 trillion a year on what we call a healthcare system, but it's really a sick care system. It costs us $3 trillion a year, mainly to just tread water, because we're getting sicker at the same time we're going broke, and many people can't afford the care, even when they have, Obamacare, or Romney Care, as we used to call it here in Massachusetts. So the false solutions that have been created on behalf of the funders of our establishment political parties, the health insurance industry, the fossil fuels, the big manufacturers who are, just getting away with murder with these corporate trade deals, and now the Obama administration, like Bill Clinton before him, the Democrats have been pushing these corporate trade agreements that offshore our jobs and diminish wages here at home and create unemployment. You know, they've been serving their corporate taskmasters while everyday people have been thrown under the bus. So, to your question, you know, the purpose of the Green Party and my campaign, it's to lift up the real solutions that are available to us right now when we develop the courage of our convictions. Because, as those numbers pointed out, we have more than enough numbers, if people actually had the courage of their convictions and stood up, that we could win this race right now. In fact, my campaign is the only campaign that will cancel student debt. We've been advocating for free public higher education for at least 15 years, really as long as the Green Party's been around.
Right.
Now the other parties are starting to catch up on that, and they've adopted our agenda on free public higher education, and that's great. But at this point, we are the only ones that will cancel student debt. And it turns out 40 million young people who are in debt is a plurality, just about a plurality, of the voting electorate. Right. So if young people who are better equipped than anybody to spread the word that they can come out and vote green in 2016 and cancel debt, that could actually be an accomplished fact.
Are those people politically involved? They're unhappy about their debt, justifiably so. How many activists are in that group, and what can be done to increase that?
That's a great point. And we saw in the last election in 2014, we saw about 80% of young people vote with their feet for these two parties that have thrown them into debt. Right. And have thrown their jobs across the border. Right. And have created the climate crisis. So why should people come out and vote? Right. You know, there's this conventional wisdom that you have to vote for the lesser evil. Yeah. And I think what's actually happening is proof of why the lesser evil always loses. The lesser evil will always lose because it doesn't hold a candle to the real forces of the corporate dictatorship. So the economic elite is not going to vote for the lesser evil. It's not as good as far as they're concerned. Right. And everyday people don't buy the lesser evil agenda. What they offer them is just one step shy of the joblessness and the hopelessness of the Republican agenda. So people don't come out to vote for it. That's why, we often invoke the words of Alice Walker, the famous poet, novelist, who said, "The biggest way people give up power is by not knowing we have it to start with."
We'll take a short break and be right back with Jill Stein.
Math and science are far more than just subjects at school. If you're passionate about cooking food, math and science become part of your everyday life. We learn measurements, we learn fractions. That's why Time Warner Cable created Connect a Million Minds, to show young people that math and science can be fun and lead to a career of their dreams. Whether it's an engineer, a food scientist, or a rock star chef. Visit connectamillionminds.com to learn more.
Hi, we're back in conversation with our guest Jill Stein. We've been talking about student debt and her conviction that we should have a program where it's written off. So, Jill, again, do young people who have all this debt, are they aware that there's a different possibility and that there are politicians who would like to make a radical change, or are they resigned to the fact that they've got this debt, they have to pay it back, nothing's going to change?
Well, put it this way, I have yet to find the young person in debt who doesn't jump up and become a missionary for the campaign when they hear that there actually is a way forward that provides a future for them. Right. So, I think the name of the game is It's all about getting the word out.
Right.
Right now,
What you're doing right now.
exactly, and which it takes real journalists,
Right.
you know, who aren't just towing the corporate media line.
I have no funding at all.
There you go, nothing to lose. We would all be better off if we had, you know, a media that was in the public interest instead of increasingly compromised, as even, you know, NPR and PBS,
There
you
are
know,
large corporate donors.
sure are, including
Yeah.
the Koch brothers, you
Yeah.
know, and it puts a real stranglehold on what they can say.
Right.
I think right now, you know, the media, in my experience, usually will give about this much space to progressive causes.
Right.
And right now they're very focused on the combat inside the Democratic Party to
Right.
see how far Bernie Sanders will get.
Right.
I have very little doubt, just from observing the history of the Democratic Party. It has a thing called the kill switch, which is what it does to progressive candidates.
Okay.
You may have been around long enough to know, I'm not sure, but when George McGovern got the Democratic nomination
Right.
in 1972, the Democratic Party then undertook some basic reforms so something like that would never happen again.
I see.
And they created Super Tuesdays, which is basically a big corporate primary where
Right.
there are so many primaries going on at once that a candidate cannot handle the TV advertising unless they have big corporate funding.
Gotcha.
So that's one way that they eliminate candidates of integrity who are not sold out to
Okay.
corporations. But the other thing they do is they have this thing called super delegates. And you may have heard the term, but few people know what it is.
I've heard the term, and I'm one of the people who's a little unclear.
So let me explain. Super delegates are delegates that are basically appointed by the Democratic National Committee, by the inner circle of the party, which is very controlled by big money.
Right.
You know, it's the DNC that decided the Democratic Party would have a total of 6 debates this time instead of 26 as they had last time, because they're kind of circling the wagons around the standard bearer, the coronated candidate, Hillary Clinton,
Right.
and they don't want a debate. So, you know, this is how the DNC works, the Democratic National Committee, which also controls the presidential debates and so on.
Okay.
So the DNC appoints delegates to the Democratic Convention where the president is nominated.
Okay.
Most people think that voters control the nomination through our primaries. Voters decide. But in fact, what happens is that there's extra delegates, about 20% of the delegates are not controlled by any primary. They are controlled directly by the DNC, who appoints insiders, essentially, as an insurance policy to be sure that the nomination will go to the coronated corporate candidate.
Okay. And those are the super delegates.
Those are the super delegates. And the other thing the DNC can do, like you may have noted that they arbitrarily, somewhat arbitrarily, shut down the Sanders database last week.
Yes. Yes. After
Which-
there was a bit of a scandal where somebody from the Sanders campaign saw some information about the Clinton campaign that they weren't supposed to see, supposedly.
That's right.
Right.
Yes, and instead of handling it sort of in a direct way, the DNC went to the press and shut down the Sanders access to the database,
Right.
which is kind of how the DNC works. Here's some other things the DNC has done. When Howard Dean's anti-war campaign got going, they created this Dean Scream of a public relations campaign to basically bring him down in the polls and destroy his campaign. That's another thing the DNC does if they see a campaign of integrity that bucks the status quo. The DNC has a kill switch, so they can also run these fear and smear campaigns, which they did to eliminate Howard Dean. They redistricted Dennis Kucinich and kept him out of the debates because he was running a campaign of real integrity. We saw the same thing happen as far back as Jesse Jackson, who was running, you know, during the civil rights movement and running on a very strong, you know, campaign for racial justice. And they did a smear campaign against him, accusing him of being an anti-Semite and being anti-Israel. So the DNC has its stranglehold on the process because the DNC represents the big money behind the party. So there have been many wonderful campaigns inside of the Democratic Party. Jesse Jackson, Dennis Kucinich, Howard Dean, etc. They raise very important issues, but they kind of provide a smokescreen because what happens while these great campaigns are going forward? The party keeps marching to the right and becomes more of a tool of Wall Street, corporatism, imperialism, big and endless wars, the drone policy, the attack on immigrant rights and the massive deportations, the attack on the press and the use of the Espionage Act to imprison and accuse more members of the press than all prior presidents put together. So the Democratic Party keeps marching to the right while they run these bubble campaigns, which are wonderful, but inside a bubble that they will burst and they will then absorb the resources and the people. So
is that what's happening with Bernie Sanders now? Is he a token progressive candidate in the Democratic machine?
Well,
or is that a tough question to answer?
Well, I think history speaks for itself. And as much as I admire his campaign and agree with his domestic issues, not so much with his foreign policy issues. His domestic issues, except on debt, where he has not taken the principled position for young people. We have a lot in common, you know, on sort of wanting to see an economy that works for working people and not just for the big banks and the war profiteers. Although I must say he's also kind of in the war profiteer category. In fact, he is, according to, I believe it's the Huffington Post that found him among the top 6 recipients of funding from the defense industry, which may go a long way to say, you know, why he is still supporting that this catastrophic war on terror that he doesn't want us to fight, but he wants the Saudis to fight it. Unfortunately, the Saudis they're a big part of the problem. The Saudis have instigated terrorism all over the world, and we can talk more about that.
Saudi Arabia yet either, have we?
And who was it that was responsible for 9/11? Yes.
Well, I believe there were a lot of Saudis on those planes.
Predominantly Saudis,
Why haven't we invaded Saudi Arabia?
Well, we made a pact with Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
Actually, FDR made a pact with Saudi Arabia that they supply the oil and we will look the other way on everything else that they do. Why are we arming Saudi Arabia? $100 billion worth of arms sales in the last 5 years alone. And those arms are not only going to human rights abuses like the war on the people of Yemen carried out by the Saudis, which is widely considered a war crime. But the Saudis, you know, have been funding every jihadi group since way back at the Mujahideen, when the CIA and the Saudis first cooked up this idea that the antidote to national secularism, when the Afghani government way back in the 70s was leaning left and doing useful things for its people, we wanted to get certain oil pipelines through Afghanistan that they weren't looking favorably on. And that's when the CIA and the Saudis began creating an international jihadi movement in the form of the Mujahideen, which we armed and we funded along with the Saudis, and created the disaster that continues to evolve, not only in Afghanistan, but this is the playbook that continues to be played out. So, to your point about Bernie Sanders, we differ on foreign policy and how to address terrorism, and I'd love to get to that if we have a moment. But I think there's little doubt that the wagons have been circled intensively around Hillary Clinton, and she's being rammed through. This isn't the first time this has happened. This is what happens over and over. I think Bernie Sanders is doing the right thing. He's just doing it in the wrong party.
Okay. Well, that's a significant point. Let's talk about terrorism and the difference between you and Bernie Sanders and your opinions about what should happen. Great.
What we need to do about terrorism is to stop it in its tracks. Now, the conventional wisdom, which flies in the face of the last 10 years of our dreadful experience.
Yeah.
But the conventional wisdom that continues to be drummed into our heads through the corporate media and through both political parties and all of the candidates, all, with no exception, to some extent Rand Paul, but he's bought into this war thing as well now. What they say is that you got to bomb the hell out of them, you know, shoot them up, bomb them, light the sands on fire, you know. But unfortunately, you can't bomb terrorism.
Right.
To quote a wonderful Middle East expert who said this the other day, you bomb people, you don't bomb terrorism.
Right.
Terrorism doesn't have some fortress that you can just go and knock out conveniently.
Right.
And so what we've been doing is these wars of regime change, supposedly in countries that are compromised by terrorism. But what you do then is you just create more terrorists. A study came out a couple months ago about drones, which are supposed to be, you know, the surgical strike.
Precision.
Exactly.
Precision attacks.
Exactly.
Right.
And what did this study show? It showed 9 times out of 10, they're not even getting their intended target. So they're killing as many, you know, 9 times more of the wrong people than they are of their desired targets. However, even their desired targets are essentially assassinations, which we should not be conducting anyhow, which is a terrible violation of international law and gets us into trouble.
There's
So
supposedly a kill list in the
exactly.
Obama administration.
And there's Terror Tuesdays where we decide who we're going to assassinate next. This is absolutely shameful and a disaster and a dismantling of the whole architecture of international law, which is what our foreign policy should be based on: international law, human rights, and diplomacy. We have a foreign policy that's been based on, you know, pure, brute military might and economic domination. This whole concept of American exceptionalism is like sort of an adolescent who's still going through their narcissistic state where they think that it's all about them. It's like, hello, get a life, you know, grow up here.
Right.
Let's have a real foreign policy where we actually sit down and talk to people. Let's participate in the world community like we are not, you know, the world dictator here. Right. And the point about terrorism is that there are actually very effective things that we can do. Let's not do the wrong thing, because look at where it's gotten us. Regime change, which has basically created failed states, especially, you know, where we've gone in and, you know, changed government.
Or just remove the government.
Just remove, exactly, which is more often all that we accomplish.
Right.
That's right. So failed states, massive refugee migrations, which is threatening to tear apart the European Union right now, an utter disaster. You know, and just basically, you know, an endless war. And we have really escalated the terrorist organizations themselves. Taliban has far more territory now than they did before we went into Afghanistan. Right. Al-Qaeda was a local struggle. It wasn't an international movement, which it is now. And we created ISIS out of the chaos in Iraq. So, and that's widely recognized. Yeah. And yet now all of the candidates are basically saying, let's go in and shoot them up some more. They debate who should be leading the fight, whether it should be our troops on the ground, our airplanes in the air, or whether it should be the Russians, as some people say, or whether it should be the Saudis.
Right.
So here's the other way forward. And we're calling this a peace offensive, because peace is not about just sitting back on your laurels and withdrawing and letting the mess, you know, continue to fester and get worse. It's about actually doing the right thing and reversing those policies that have caused this mess in the first place. So we have been arming all sides of the conflict in the Middle East. It's about time we create a weapons embargo. Since we're providing the majority of the arms, we can single-handedly begin to shut down the armaments. But we should be talking to the Russians about this, as well as to the French and other parties as well. So we can lead the way in an international arms embargo to shut down all of the fighting in the Middle East. We can shut down the funding. We've been telling the Saudis since 9/11 that they need to clean up their act and their sponsorship of terrorism, which they have not done. Hillary Clinton herself attested to that in some of the signed cables, signed by her, that were leaked by WikiLeaks when she was Secretary of State.
Right.
The Saudis are still leading the charge here for terrorism, funding it, arming it. So we need to start telling our so-called allies that we're actually going to put teeth behind this. And if they continue to do that, that we are going to freeze their bank accounts or seize their bank accounts for these massive violations of international law and human rights and ongoing war crimes. So we can actually put some real heft into shutting down the funding of terrorism. Finally, you have militias which are crossing Turkey's border to get into Syria. So, you know, this constant flow of reinforcements can actually be shut down so that we can stop this international jihadi movement going into Syria. And Turkey is a member of NATO, so they need to act responsibly. And if you know, their membership in NATO needs to be put on the line. And, you know, they need to understand that there will be consequences if they don't shut this border down. Same thing goes with their bank accounts, because they too are among those who are shipping arms to terrorist groups, including in Syria. And finally, there's the oil that ISIS sells in order to support itself. So, you know, that oil is being bought particularly by the Turks, and then it's being sold at a profit. So Turkey also needs to step up to the plate on that account. So you've got 4 really powerful things that we can do to stop ISIS in its tracks. We should not continue this catastrophic policy of regime change, and even if it's not regime change, you know, laying the groundwork for regime change. Bombs and bullets are not the way to stop terrorism. We have to stop funding it, stop arming it, and become a member of the world community that doesn't hoard the wealth and the profit of all nations, which this country is doing. 84% of the world is living in poverty right now. 84%. That's not, and that's deep poverty.
Right.
That is not a tenable and survivable situation. You know, we need to step up as a partner and not, you know, continue this foreign policy of massive economic and military domination, which is extremely destabilizing and is beginning to blow back at us big time.
Let's pause there for a moment, take a break, and then we'll continue with this topic. This is In Conversation. We're talking to Jill Stein. We'll be back in just a moment.
Hi, I'm Matt Damon, and I'm a proud supporter of the Greater Boston Food Bank. To support the food bank and your hungry neighbors, you can volunteer time, make a donation, or donate food. Please go to www.gbfb.org to learn more.
Welcome back. This is In Conversation. I'm your host, Steve Iverson, and we're talking with Jill Stein about Green Party aims and her recent attendance at the climate summit in Paris. So, Jill, you were saying that a degree and a half is a realistic goal, and that the Green Party and you would like to see emissions cut to 0 by 2030.
That's right. Which means we need an emergency program. When Pearl Harbor was bombed at the outset of the Second World War for the U.S., we did not have, you know, airplanes. We didn't have ships. You know, we didn't have anything to fight a war with. We were essentially 0% of our GDP was focused on war and militarism.
Right.
And we went from 0% to 25% of GDP in 6 months. I mean, this is staggering, and it shows what, you know, what we as Americans can do when we are faced with a national emergency.
It can be done.
Absolutely. And I think we need, you know, we need elected leaders who recognize the seriousness of this problem. You know, as Hansen pointed out, Jim Hansen pointed out, we're at risk for losing all coastal cities, and the mass of population, you know, somewhere around 1/3 to 1/2 of population that's concentrated around those cities. We're at risk for losing them, not to mention our nuclear power plants that are often in coastal locations.
Right.
once you get into massive breakup of your ice sheets, it's not like it's a slow melt, you know, it's a tumbling into the sea of massive amounts. And so you see a very rapid, you know, you'll see a series of tsunamis that basically don't retreat.
Right.
So this is just incredible chaos and destruction. We don't want to go there. You know, we've also heard recently how the marine food chain is very much at risk for collapsing. There are studies showing, you know, and I come to this with background as a medical doctor, with a special interest in the environment, and spent many years working with Physicians for Social Responsibility to help explain to the public what is going on with this climate crisis, exactly why it's a crisis, why it needs emergency mobilization. And I was very much part of the work that PSR, Physicians for Social Responsibility, and other health groups have done to point out that this is, you know, this is not just the environment, folks. This is like, this is the basis of civilization. So what you're seeing in these new studies about the marine food chain is that the little microscopic creatures at the very bottom of the food chain, they're losing their shells, because when you have rising levels of carbon dioxide, that filters into the water and makes the water more acid. So you have the acidification of the oceans, and that prevents shells from forming. That's partly why coral, you know, doesn't work and dies in the more acid oceans. There are other reasons too, but that's part of it. So at the bottom of the food chain, we're looking at these little creatures that are not forming their shells properly, and they are at risk for collapsing at the bottom of the food chain, which means then it goes all the way up. And the other issue is that this is where our oxygen comes from. Our oxygen is largely produced in the deep oceans by the microscopic creatures. So, you know, all kinds of, you know, unthinkable scenarios are becoming thinkable now. And as Barack Obama, you know, it was almost a joke to listen to him talk about how Bill Gates and you know, the Facebook founder, you know, Mark Zuckerberg are going to come up with great solutions. They're going to solve this.
They want to have an energy miracle.
Yeah, exactly. That they're going to come up with devices or geoengineering, but you know, ecology is far too complex for silver bullets, far too complex, and you usually do more harm than good.
Are there other countries that are doing these things better? Are there other countries that seem a little bit closer to the conditions that you would like to see here as a result of the changes you've discussed? Absolutely.
And I mean, you can even look at China. China has begun to turn the corner, and they still have a ways to go, but they've just adopted this whole new economic model. In fact, I did a forum with the deputy lead negotiator from China at the COP.
That was at the climate change conference?
Yes, it was. And in fact, the link to that will be on our Facebook page, which is Dr. Jill Stein, and that's DR with no period. Jill Stein is our Facebook page. And Jill2016.com is our webpage, so people can go there to see actually a video of the whole forum that we did, not only with the deputy lead negotiator from China talking about what our two countries could do, but also with the indigenous community that was also there doing a panel talking about how we actually have the capacity to solve this right now. So China's adopted this model, a new model for economic development that no longer prioritizes growth and GDP. Instead, they're calling for conversion to an ecological economy that is an economy that's sustainable. And they show, you know, where their economy is right now shows what happens when you just go for growth and that alone. They're now having all these red alert days
you can't breathe in Beijing most days.
Exactly. And now they have these alert days where they call off school and everybody stays home from work. They can't go out. So, you know, that's where we're going. But instead, they're calling for massive investments in solar and wind. Right now, you know, their policy is still, it's got a ways to go, because they're still looking at developing to catch up to industrialized nations, to bring up their standard of living, get people out of poverty. And they're not going to start to cut their fossil fuel emissions till 2030, but they need to do it like starting now. So we hope to continue to have an ongoing dialogue with the Chinese, which was really very exciting and wonderful. But you can look at countries in Europe, for example, in Denmark or Germany, where the majority of their energy use now on a sunny day is coming from solar. And, you know, we are all, I should say, working on solar storage so that you don't have to depend on sunny days.
Right.
And you don't have to, right now, wind tends to blow at night and sun shines during the day, and you alternate, but we need to store all of that. And fortunately, Tesla, you know, the electric car, has developed a whole new battery, which will soon be available for home use and for distributed cheap energy. And the price is has gone down enormously to where solar is just about competitive right now with most forms of fossil fuel.
This is a common criticism of solar power. You know, you can't use it at night. But whenever I hear that, I say, I think we've got a lot of battery technology out there, and it must be getting better.
It is, exactly, it is. And ideally you want to, you know, you not only want storage, but you also want access to wind power.
Right.
And so that when you don't have solar, you can draw on wind. But we have batteries which are actually being field tested right now that permit, you know, round-the-clock storage. So that problem is going to be solved. And when you have large national investments like what China is doing and what we should be doing, then you have kind of critical mass to make those breakthroughs. So there should be no excuse, given how rapidly the cost has come down, there's no excuse not to invest in that right now. And yet we see, you know, we see the Democratic and Republican Party putting up all kinds of roadblocks. We should be doing what, you know, what Germany did, where they basically allowed individual homeowners and businesses to sell back to the grid at a guaranteed rate that made it affordable for them to convert and adopt the technology and install the solar panels to start with.
Right.
We need to be doing that. There are some cities, I believe Berkeley, where the city actually takes on that cost and will install at virtually no cost to the renters or the homeowners. So there are good programs. We have models in what Germany has done that we could emulate.
And these things can get started locally. You know, it can start in Berkeley.
It sure could.
But from the bottom up instead of from the top down, perhaps.
Lexington, in fact, has been, you know, trying to lead the way to municipal utilities,
Right.
which can then, you know, develop kind of critical mass and economy of scale to enable a whole town to convert. And the Democratic majority in the legislature sells out year after year after year to the big private utilities that don't want to see renewable energy come in because it's obviously, you know, off their bottom line. So I don't know how long that battle has been going on. You know, after a while you stop paying attention to it because we just have a corporate dictatorship that rules. You know, for myself in Massachusetts, when the Democratic legislature repealed clean elections on a voice vote after we the people had passed it by a 2-to-1 majority, you know, to me that was the heads up that the change we need is just not going to happen inside the Democratic Party. And that was like, you know, 15 years ago or so, and that just continues to be borne out. So I really encourage people to just don't wait for them to come save you. They are not going to save you. Corporate America is not going to hand you your future on a platter. We are going to have to stand up and vote them out of office, despite the fear campaigns and the smear campaigns that they conduct against independent small parties and small candidates with integrity. You know, we have the capacity to actually lead the way forward in a way that works for us all. It's not going to happen with corporate America sponsoring the political parties who are basically being run by the fossil fuel corporations, the predatory banks, and the war profiteers. They will, you know, they will give lip service and they will make little adjustments around the margins, but the fundamentals of policy are still shared between the Democratic and Republican parties. The ongoing wars, the offshoring of our jobs with these corporate trade agreements, the abuse and the exploitation of an entire generation of young people who've been exploited by debt. Just recently, it was a bipartisan bill that allowed the banks now to harass young people with student loans. I can't tell you the number of people I've heard from who are being constantly harassed with text messages and phone calls about their debt. Almost half of young people are unable to pay their debt. They're basically in default,
right.
Though there are, special names that are given to those default, but they cannot repay that debt. So we're really up a creek right now with the world that's been created by a two-party corporate system. And I really encourage people to have the courage of your convictions. We're told that you have to vote for the lesser evil, but and that you have to be very afraid of standing up with a vote of courage. But it's really important to see where that politics of fear has led us, whether it was in the Obama race or, before that, Bush, Nader, Gore. Where has all this led? The politics of fear delivers everything we were afraid of. All those reasons people were told that you had to vote for the lesser evil because you didn't want declining wages. You didn't want immigrants being deported and demonized. You didn't want the war on the press. All the ongoing war on terrorism and the drones and the spy state. All those things you didn't want, so you were supposed to take the safe, lesser evil vote. But that's exactly exactly what we get. So our motto is forget the lesser evil. It's time to fight for the greater good. We need to stand up for what we deserve. Don't let them intimidate you. The biggest thing to be afraid of is doing nothing and allowing this, this system to push us all over the cliff, which is where we're going. And pretty soon, we're not going to be able to climb our way back up the cliff, which is what we're trying to do now. So I really encourage people to think long and hard. Support Bernie if that's where your inclination is, but when Bernie gets knocked out of contention by the DNC, you have a plan B here in the form of our campaign. And if you don't buy the propaganda that we can make change, make revolution inside of a corporate party, in my view, the revolution will not be televised and it will not happen inside of the corporate Democratic Party. Let's get real.
Even the most progressive part of our political world is not broadcast now. Some people would claim that it doesn't get as much coverage as it deserves.
Exactly.
Even now.
Exactly. That's right. Even the Sanders campaign is being basically shut out and silenced.
Yeah.
Which is why we need a deep system change, which is why we the people need the courage of our convictions. We need to work through honest, rare journalists like yourself. We need to, and through the community cable network, which is a wonderful resource that's still accessible to everyday people.
And this interview will also be on the LexMedia website and available to anybody anywhere in the world over the internet.
Well, that is wonderful. And likewise, through Facebook, we have mobilized before. We as a people stopped. We stopped the privatization of the internet twice through grassroots mobilizations when the press wouldn't cover it one bit. Right. When our political leaders wouldn't acknowledge it, we forced their hand. We did so recently around the FCC. We changed the vote of the FCC. We have succeeded. We stopped the first war on Syria around the chemical weapons. We forced the hand of Congress because they were coming home for vacation, and we didn't take no for an answer. And we need that courage of our convictions. We need to recognize the reality of where we are, the reality of their propaganda that tries to convince us of our powerlessness. And the reality, in Alice Walker's words, is that we do have the numbers. The minute we stand up with the courage of our convictions, we not only have the solutions, we have the vision, we have the values of the American people who support these issues. Healthcare is a human right through a Medicare for all system. Once again, we're seeing healthcare fail through this privatization scheme, which is essentially what Obamacare is. It's a it's a bonanza for health insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies.
The law forced every citizen to become a customer of a private insurance company.
Exactly. That's what it did. And yet, when you needed care, you found that that little piece of paper that you were so proud of actually has enough holes that you can drive a hearse through.
High deductibles, high monthly costs.
Exactly. And medical bankruptcies have not been reduced one iota. Not under Romney Care here in Massachusetts and not under Obamacare nationally. And the whole system is failing now, as it was really designed to do, because many of the financial supports are not kicking in. It's basically been, nitpicked. And it's essentially on its way out right now. It's not working. So, as you probably know, one of the virtues of single payer is that it actually pays for itself. It's like the Green New Deal, which pays for itself in reducing military costs and reducing healthcare costs, because we all get so much healthier. Under a single payer system, we save so much money by eliminating the high costs of the middleman, the CEOs, the advertising, the competition between private insurance companies, and the outrageous profiteering of not only the insurance companies, but especially the pharmaceutical companies. We've saved so much money that it's enough to actually cover everybody, from prenatal to the grave, full coverage across the lifespan, but also full coverage, including all those things that get left out now, like your eyeglasses or your hearing aid or your mental health or your reproductive health care. Everything gets covered. So, that is another reason why we feel it's so important for us to reject the propaganda that tells us we are powerless, that we are, that it's hopeless, that the solutions just aren't there. This is a system, this is a house of cards that's waiting to collapse. It's very important for us to stand up now and get on the record and start building a force that will continue to grow, not only a political force, but the social movements for health care as a human right, for climate, for abolishing student debt. These are the movements that are there. They need a political voice. That's what the Green Party's about, and that's what our campaign is pushing forward. So I encourage people to just have the strength of your convictions. Don't be talked into hopelessness and powerlessness. Stand up for what we actually deserve and that we truly need if we are to survive even decades into this century.
Okay, very good. And let's take another short break, and then we'll be back talking again with Jill Stein.
I don't know what it's like.
I don't know what it's like to be in a war.
I don't know what it's like. I don't know what it's like to be
shot at.
To be put in harm's way.
Put my life on the line.
I don't know what it's like, but I do know no one comes back the same. No matter how tough you are,
How brave, how patriotic.
anybody can get hurt.
And not just physically hurt.
If you're a service member
Or in a military family and you're feeling hopeless, you're not alone.
please call this number. It's confidential and free.
Your family needs you.
We need you.
Thank you for your service.
Hi, we're back with In Conversation. I'm your host, Steve Iverson, and we're talking with Jill Stein. Jill, we have a few minutes left, and I wanted to ask you about immigration and some of the ideas that have been put forth by candidates. Donald Trump, in particular, has had some people might say outrageous things to say, depending on your own beliefs, about immigration, about sending people back to Mexico, about building a wall. What are your own thoughts about that, and about where things stand now and what might be helpful?
Great. Yeah, I think, we're seeing Donald Trump and many others seek to, what shall we say, seek to benefit by whipping up fear and hate. This brings out the absolute worst in us, and I think this is it's even beyond like sort of how you happen to feel. I think by any standard of human rights and justice, that the kind of language that's being used here is unacceptable, outrageous, immoral. This is nothing short of demagoguery. This is, I think, dangerous. It's very dangerous because, you know, hate is a bad thing, but at a time when so many people are very insecure and we see, you know, people really struggling to survive economically, it's not hard to demonize certain groups, vulnerable groups, to demonize them. And you see people now committing horrible acts who've been inspired by Donald Trump. And, you know, at the outset it was Mexican immigrants he was demonizing. Now it's Muslims. He wants to shut down all immigration to the U.S., not allow Muslims to come in.
Which even Dick Cheney thinks is a ridiculous idea.
It sure does.
But go ahead.
Yeah, and even the Bushes, for that matter. You know, he wants to kill the relatives of terrorists.
The families.
Yes.
Yeah.
What kind of a monster is this? I think it's important to remind people that Republicans are 21% of the electorate. So when Donald Trump is running at 30%, that's 30% of 21%. So this is 7% of the American public. He has enormous high disapproval ratings. So again, he should not be used as a tool to try to frighten us off of our basic human values, our support for human rights. We created the immigration crisis, whether you're looking at refugees coming from El Salvador or Guatemala or Mexico. These are people who are fleeing the drug wars created by the United States, the drug wars that we fund, that we create. And I don't mean we the people, I mean we are irresponsible misleaders. Those same misleaders destabilized many governments in the form of coups and overthrows in Guatemala and El Salvador, supporting those coups, for example. It's where the U.S. has intervened that you have the crisis, where you have people fleeing for their lives. And it was NAFTA that put millions of peasant farmers out of business in Mexico, so that they were fleeing here for their lives. You know, for people who have a problem with immigrants coming here as refugees, how about we work to stop the U.S. government from creating those refugees to start with? And the same exact thing is true now in the Middle East, where people are largely fleeing from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, the countries where our regime change policies have been so catastrophically wrong. So we can fix this, but we can fix this in a way that affirms human rights, that welcomes refugees, and that relieves them, at the same time that we stop devastating their countries at home and create a world based on human rights, international law, diplomacy, and a world that actually can work for all of us, a world and an America that works for us all. This needs to be the basis of how we go forward. And this is within our reach. The motto for our campaign is, it's in our hands. It's what are we going to do about it? We have the solutions. We have the numbers. Do we have the courage to stand up? Our lives depend on it. I hope that people will think about this seriously and do the right thing and start to stand up now while we still have our future to take back.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming on and for talking. And I wish you the very best with your campaign and with your activism.